Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this new INCIPE event. This is the first one that we organize in English in this new format, but not the first one that we organize with our distinguished today's speaker, Serge Stroobants, for presenting, as usual at INCIPE, but for the first time in this format, the Global Peace Index this year. Also with a on the effects of the COVID-19. Ambassador Manuel Alabart, who experienced right now some problems with the camera, but he's going in any case to present Serge Stroobants at this activity. And in order not to intervene again, I remember you can send your questions through the private chat, and then in YouTube. Remember, this is not really a Chatham House rule event as usual, because everything that you will said will be recording and stayed in the YouTube channel. And then I will pick up for Serge all the questions that I will pose at the end of the intervention. Anyway, thank you, Serge, for being with us. The third time, but the first one in this format. Thank you. Manuel, Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Vicente. A big welcome to Mr. Serge Stroobants. Glad to hear. I'm extremely sorry that you cannot see me. I hope I will be able to solve this problem throughout your talk today. So I welcome all our listeners today for yet another presentation of the very prestigious Global Peace Index. As Vicente has said, this is the third time we do it, but this time is especially significant because we're in the middle of this big pandemic, this big COVID crisis, and whatever you might tell us today, Mr. Stroobants, will be extremely interesting for our listeners. As far as Mr. Stroobants is concerned, let me say he's a staff officer of the Belgian Army for many, many years. He has a very important operational experience, more than 25 years, if I'm not mistaken, and also a very important academic background. He has served at all levels on operational command and also at the strategic level at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And if I'm not mistaken, you've served in several multinational operations in the Balkans, in Africa, in Rwanda, in Benin, in the Cape Verde Islands, but also a very prominent activity, very prominent in the academic field. Mr. Stroobants has been awarded licenses on political science and international relations. You have degrees from the university, the Free University of Brussels, the Institute Jean Moulin of Lyon, but today you represent many institutions, but today a very specific one, an Australian think tank which is presenting every year this Global Peace Index. It's called the Institute for Economic and Peace, and so we're very happy to have you again in this presentation at this very special time. Mr. Stroobants, it's an honor to have you here. This is your house. We are your listeners, so you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to present again the Global Peace Index at INCIPE. As has been said, it's a tradition now already for the third time in a row, so 2018, 19, and 20. And it's the first time in this virtual setting with the webinar. So I should have prepared coffee, orange juice, and some sweets to really be in the ambiente of INCIPE and when you present over there. And it's always a great opportunity to do this in Madrid. As I said, thank you very much also for the introduction, and welcome also to the participants in this webinar. What I will do now is share my screen and use the PowerPoint to present you the results and the key findings of the Global Peace Index of this year. So please bear with me for a second, and we will be able to do so. Do you see my presentation now? Is this working? So my presentation is visible. I can start. Okay, let's start. So, I mean, if some of you can just say a little word in his microphone to tell me that everything is positive, that would be nice. Otherwise, I just start with the presentation. So, it's this year, Global Peace Index 2020, and as every year, we quantify and we measure peace in a complex world. Just a few words about the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we do research for a lot of governments, international organizations, sister think tanks in support, and for some international NGOs also. Our work is included as references in a lot of books and a lot of university courses. And next to the research that we produce, we also put a lot of effort in promoting the results of our research. So those are the figures of our media reach and outreach last year. Just for this launch, in the first 3 to 4 weeks, we have achieved figures of more than 6 billion in media reach, close to 3,000 press releases and press articles. So we are really pleased with the evolution at this time. So I'm going to talk today about 2 publications, the Global Peace Index 2020. This is an annual report, but also about an extra edition, a special edition, special research called COVID-19 and Peace. Both documents and all our research are open source, free online on our website, visionofhumanity.org, of course, clicking on reports. So as said, we are headquartered in Sydney, Australia, and have regional offices all over the world. So in Europe, our main office here in Brussels, supported by an office in The Hague, in New York, close to the UN, also connected to an office in Mexico City, because we produce annually also now for the 6th year already, a national index for Mexico that is ranking the 32 Mexican states according to the levels of peacefulness. And about 18 months ago, we opened an office in Harare, Zimbabwe. So this is the 14th edition of the Global Peace Index. We rank 163 countries and territories according to the levels of peacefulness. That's about 99.7% of the population. So I think we are entitled to call it a Global Peace Index. We use 23 different indicators weighted on a scale from 1 to 5. We developed this index ourselves, and it's guided and overseen by a panel of experts. So the 23 indicators that we use are distributed over 3 specific domains. So we have 6 measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict. We have 10 measures of social safety and security, so clearly looking at internal security. And we have 7 measures of militarization, of which 1 positive indicator, and that would be the funding, the investment made in UN peacekeeping operations. Now let's have a look at the key findings. For every index, every report that we produce, we also make available online on our website an interactive map like this. On a first glance, you can also already identify the dark green or darker green and green patches on the map. And those are, of course, the most peaceful countries in the world or less impacted by violence. And on the other hand, also the red patches that are the least peaceful countries of the world, most impacted by violence. And it also allows you to already identify some regional clusters of peace or violence. It's an interactive map. It means you can click on each of the countries, get access to the data, get access to the ranking per indicator, per family of indicator, and the global ranking also. So this year, we have experienced a decrease in peacefulness by 0.34%. I mean, it might just sound as a percentage or a figure, but it's important to know that this is the 9th deterioration in the last 12 years. We saw that about the same amount of countries deteriorated and improved in peacefulness, and the main reason for those changes are in the improvements. the terrorism impact. So after the peak of terrorism in 2014-15, really also connected with the peak of the Islamic State, we have experienced a decrease in the past 5 years. So really going from 33,500 casualties by terrorism in 2014-15 to 8,000 last year. So that's a decrease. And last year we really saw a dramatic decrease, minus 75%. So that's very good news. The homicide rate is also an indicator that has been decreasing over the past years. So that's very positive. And we also experienced less exchange of weapons, imports and exports last year. The deterioration came from the intensity of internal conflict. I would say the impact of the number of refugees and IDPs. So we have had the International Day of the Refugees and IDPs about, I think it was last week. Of course, the staggering figure of 18 million, which is an increase of 10 million in a year. So last year when I presented those figures, it was 70 million. This year estimated 80 million displaced persons in the world. And over the past decade, this number has doubled. So for 40 million 10 years ago to 80 million today. And we also saw that the political terror scale was one of the indicators. That's what's responsible for the deterioration. Political terror scale, this is use of terror by a government. This is extrajudicial killings and imprisonment without trial. So basically, no respect of human rights as such. So the highlights for this year: Iceland is still the most peaceful country in the world, really having a solid number one position for a large amount of years, almost all editions of the Global Peace Index. The largest improvements were seen in the Caucasus region. So with Azerbaijan and Armenia, we settled a border dispute on Nagorno-Karabakh with a ceasefire. So that's always very positive for your levels of peacefulness. This also had an impact on the regional levels of peacefulness. Also, they're the largest regional improvement for Russia and Eurasia. And we have seen for Europe that Europe remained the most peaceful region of the world. And we also saw some increased political instability that which led to deterioration in peacefulness. Over a large period of time, we have seen an harmonization also of the levels of peace throughout Europe. So Western and Eastern Europe really harmonizing their levels of peacefulness. So the more negative side of the index, at the bottom of the index, we clearly see that Afghanistan remains the world's least peaceful nation of the world. Of course, with the deterioration of the past decade, this is the second year in a row that Afghanistan is there. Afghanistan is also the number one most impacted country by terrorism, ranking number one on our annual global terrorism index. So really not a good position and I would say a good outlook for Afghanistan. Benin and Nicaragua, the largest deterioration. So Nicaragua, this is the second year in a row. Clearly internal conflict, levels of violence, also political terror scale, and political instability. Benin, political instability after, I would say, quite violent elections, and also the influence of violent extremism in the country that is bordering Sahel or countries like Burkina Faso and Mali. South America and Central America are the largest regional deteriorations. This is also the second year in a row. This is a trend that is setting up. And we really see these two regions deteriorating with high numbers, a high percentage of decrease of the levels of peacefulness. The MENA region, it's still the least peaceful region of the world. However, we saw some slight improvements by the death from terrorism and also the intensity of internal conflict. So this is the top 10 of this year's Global Peace Index. So Iceland, New Zealand, I would say they are always there, number 1 and 2. And then we see a lot of smaller liberal democracies, smaller European democracies in the top 10, with Canada, with Japan and Singapore. So clearly when you open a little bit there, the spectrum, and you go to the top 30, 40, even 50, you will find back almost all European countries in the top of the Global Peace Index. So clearly systems, liberal democracies also applying multilateralism or multilateral approach to international relations. Those are the countries that are able to develop higher and better levels and more sustainable levels of peacefulness. Now, when we look at the bottom, I would say it's like the expected countries to see at the bottom of the index. clearly in the violence trap, in conflict, or just recovering or just getting out of conflict, still impacted by a lot of fragility. So really countries that have been there for a long time and that will have large difficulties to recover from this position. So now if we open the time window to about 10 to 12 years, I said in the beginning, we have experienced 9 deteriorations in peacefulness over the past 12 years. Only 3 improvements, and 2 of those were very, very slight improvements, like last year, only by 0.09%. So clearly this is leading to this conclusion over a period of 12 years. It's a peace decline by 2.50%, almost 2.5%. And what is also very interesting here, next to the fact that approximately the same amount of countries increased and improved, decreased and improved, it's the fact that the speed at which countries are improving or decreasing is absolutely different. So we see an average of 2% in the increase in peacefulness, where we see an average of almost 13% in the decrease in peacefulness. And this is automatically leading to this inequality in global peace that we experience today, or that we notice today, with this widening gap between the most and the least peaceful countries in the world. We had special attention this year on civil unrest and its evolution over the past decade. We have seen that civil unrest has increased by 244%. And if you go into the details, riots, which can be considered more the violent part of protests and demonstrations, increased by 282%, and general strikes more than 800%. Last year, 96 countries experienced a violent demonstration. And we have also seen that citizens protest for a wide range of issues, such as economic hardship. I mean, what is really going on at the moment, race or racism, use of racism, police brutality, and corruption. So a large palette of topics and issues for which people take the grievances and frustrations to the streets. And the region in which this has most been utilized, this is Europe. So basically we see that European citizens really use their fundamental freedom to freedom of speech, but also freedom to gather and to protest. But Europe is also the continent having the largest amount of those protests, but also the lowest level of violence used in this protest. Only 35% of the civil unrest over the past decade was violent. This is completely different in other parts of the world. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa, we saw an increase of civil unrest by 6 to 800%, and almost all the demonstrations there turn out to be violent. What we also expect is that the economic recession, the economic crisis that is developing now in the aftermath of the pandemic, will increase the likelihood of demonstration and riots, and the levels of violence that is going to be used there will be correlated or in line with the level of preparedness and the reaction of countries to the pandemic. Every time we produce an index, we also identify the economic value of peace, or the economic impact of the violence that is related in the index. So the economic impact of violence 2020 has been estimated to $14.5 trillion US. This is a very, we can only count what we can measure. So we consider this to be a very conservative estimation. I would say times 2, times 2.5 would be much closer to reality. This is about 10.6% of the world GDP, of about $1,900 US for every person per year participating in this webinar. So just imagine what we could achieve if we decrease this amount of money by 1 or 10%. 1% of this amount of money, of the cost of violence, equals the global budget for overseas aid development. 10% of the cost of violence equals the global budget, annual budget for foreign direct investment. Just imagine what we could do if we would reduce the cost of violence. This is the distribution of this budget. So about 75 to 80% in prevention of violence, so both against external and internal threats. Military expenditure about 40%, internal security about 35%, 34-35%. This is topped by private military and security companies, about 5.6%. And then we really come at the quantification of the impact of the effects of the use of violence. So homicide, 7.7, suicide, which is considered a violent ending or violent termination of human life, conflict, and violent crime. So clearly, prevention or the fear of violence or the identification of threats is generating about 75 to 80% of the cost of violence. There is a special chapter on COVID-19 and peace, and I've said also this specific research that is produced this year. So what we have seen, so one of the first correlation that we have established was the correlation between the air travel and the take-up of COVID-19. So after China, and also within China, but after China, it's the western part of the world, so I would say the most interconnected by air travel, but also economically, part of the world who took up COVID-19 the fastest. And there is a clear correlation between large international airport hubs. So we see a lot of those, or at least 2 or 3 of those in Spain, with of course a lot of tourists going on. Milan can be considered one like this, even Brussels. This is a platform connecting all European countries, and especially also Africa and other continents. UK with Heathrow, New York with 3 large airports only for the city. So clearly there where there was an international airport hub, much higher numbers of COVID-19 intake. Fortunately, for most of the countries impacted this way, those were also countries showing a relatively high level of preparedness and resilience to a pandemic, and therefore the effects of the pandemic could be mitigated by those countries. What we will see also is that in the rest of the world, maybe the middle and low income countries, so I would say the less developed part of the world, the take-up will be much slower, but the impact will last for much longer because the levels of preparedness and the capacity to cope with COVID-19 is much lower in those countries. We also expect that most of the indicators in the Global Peace Index will deteriorate, but also the indicators in the Positive Peace Index. Positive peace is the systemic approach to peace. It's a concept that we have developed at the Institute for Economics and Peace, and that is looking at the attitudes, institutions, and processes that we need to put in place to create, maintain, and sustain peace, and also eventually get the economic, social, societal, governance, and ecological benefits of a more peaceful situation. So I would say these are the indicators. This is the system that is going to create peace. Also there we will see a decrease, deterioration of the indicators. Maybe one positive topic here, it's the fact that a lot of money or a lot of financial resources will be redirected to propping the economies. And so therefore there might be less money available for military expenditure, which is anyhow a trend that we have seen over the past 10 years. So the decrease in peacefulness over the last 10 years has been mostly created by conflict. We have seen that the second family of indicators, so the internal security, remains stable, and military expenditure, so militarization, decreased over the past 10 years, with more than 100 countries worldwide would decrease their military expenditure. So that's, I would say, the positive trend. But it's clearly conflict that is influencing the levels of peacefulness. We saw that certain type of crimes like drug dealing and also other types of violent and petty crime saw a temporary reduction during the lockdown, but also then during the lockdown we saw much more domestic violence, number of suicides went up, and also mental illness that on a more mid and long-term perspective could create violence, or well, I would say different issues also increased. We expect to see an increase in political instability both in the US, in Europe, and maybe a lower acceptance of measures taken by the governments. The China-US relations, who already deteriorated before the pandemic, will continue to do so, and we expect that the pandemic might accelerate or catalyze this process. This will have a clear effect on the multilateral organization or the multilateral approach to international relations, and with a clear impact on our agencies, UN agencies such as WHO or WTO. I mean, after the call for a global ceasefire by the UN Secretary General in March, we have seen what happened in the UN Security Council about this. So that's a very negative situation. I spoke about some positive news related to the fact that a lot of financial assets will be redistributed towards the economies. There are also negative news. We think that the trends of the past years of an increased funding for the UN peacekeeping operations will decrease, and that's a very negative thing to experience. And we expect the same for overseas development aid, and I think that's really a mistake we should not do, especially not according to a concept of positive peace that is providing economic increase of GDP and economic benefits when you invest in more than the economy, when you invest in peace as such. And of course, those countries really depending on this aid will be, I would say, drop back in their levels of peacefulness, but also will be more at risk for fragility and destabilization. We also expect that countries such as Brazil, Pakistan, Argentina, and Venezuela, who are already experiencing low credit ratings, will have more difficulties to borrow money that they could inject in the economy, and therefore the economic crisis for them will be stronger in effect, but also will last longer. So what we have done in this COVID-19 and peace, we have looked at the potential for recovery after the pandemic and the economic crisis. And those countries who would have higher levels of positive peace, but also favorable economic preconditions, would have more facility to cope with the effects of the pandemic and the economic crisis, and will recover better and faster. On the other hand, low positive peace levels and less favorable economic preconditions, those are countries which will really feel the impact, and for a longer period of time. And I'm really worried when I see that two regional powers, Brazil and South Africa, are in the red box. The economic preconditions that we took into account was the level of unemployment, the level of structural debt, so national debt. We also looked at the percentage of taxation within the GDP, and we also looked at the levels of dependence on international trade for the national economy. And of course, the favorable condition would be having low levels for those four indicators. This is a slide showing you, of course, the interest rate responses to US recession. So we look at economic crisis of the past, and we clearly see that I would say the system that has been applied to mitigate the effects of the recessions and the economic crises is usually the game you can play with the interest rates. If you decrease it by an average of 5% point, this is going to mitigate the effects of such a recession and a crisis. This is an option that is not available for this crisis because we started just before the pandemic with interest rates that were about 1.5%. So you cannot really use this variable to mitigate the effects of the economic crisis. What we also need to understand is that the economic crisis that is emerging now, that we are really facing at the moment, and that will only increase over the next weeks and months, is already larger than the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We launched this index and the research on COVID-19 on June 10th. So in the week before, there was a lot of exchanges with the head office in Sydney, and our economists in the head office already had calculated about $15 trillion had been injected in the economy by then. And this figure just increased over the past 3 weeks. So what we need to understand that this $15 trillion is the same amount of money that was injected in the economies after the global financial crisis of 2008. But this figure is still increasing. So what we are facing now is really one of the largest economic crises that our system has ever experienced. There is a last chapter on the Global Peace Index this year. This is focusing on, I would say, the ecological threat. So we are developing at the moment an ecological threat register. It should be ready as a standalone publication by the end of August, early September. Will be presented at the UN General Assembly, and is really looking at the impact of climate change on peace. I spoke about the 80 million IDPs and refugees worldwide. Well, about 60% of this number has been induced by natural disasters. And we see on this slide that in the past 40 years, the number of natural disasters quadrupled over the past 40 years. And the other 40%, of course, for IDPs and refugees by conflict, so to speak. So we clearly see the increasing impact of natural disaster / climate change on the global situation. So what we looked at are indicators such as food scarcity, water scarcity, demographic evolution, also the raising levels of our oceans and other climate hazards, and we compare that to levels of peacefulness. So this is an analysis that is made for water-related risks, so basically water scarcity. And you can clearly see here that the regions most affected already today and in the future are the MENA region, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean, which also are the 4 regions most impacted by violence on a global peace index. Today, about 2.4 billion people are living in an area that is already experiencing high to very high impact of climate change. A little bit more than 50% of this number, so about 1.25 billion people, are also living in a country that is in the bottom 40 of the global peace index. So we clearly see that, and this is a slide now showing the correlation between positive peace and food security, or the absence of positive peace and food insecurity. We clearly see that all the indicators that we looked at, but more indicators also, more factors influencing peace and security throughout the world, can be considered as individual storms, and that of course have an impact on violence, but that the combination of all those strategic factors are going to, are already producing some kind of superstorm, and this is really a situation that we should avoid. So this concludes my presentation at the moment. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. As said, so we are present on social media, and all our resources and the research we produce is available on our website, visionofhumanity.org. I will leave you with the last set of figures, and these are the figures who really impressed me most when I read the Global Peace Index. We estimate at the Institute for Economics and Peace that by 2050, so that's in 30 years, so in international relations, it's tomorrow, we estimate that about 143 million people will also get displaced by the effects of climate change. And this can be distributed mostly over 3 regions. So we expect 86 million people to leave Sub-Saharan Africa. We expect 40 million to leave South Asia, and we expect 17 million to leave Central America and the Caribbean. And I will let you with these words, and also let you imagine in which directions those people are going to move and are going to be displaced to. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and thank you again for the opportunity to present the results. And I'm now going to stop to share my screen.
Thank you, Serge, as always, very, very interesting for this very comprehensive presentation. In any case, I should remember that you have the report available on the web. And as far as I know, the report, if still not, it's going to be also available in Spanish at any point. Yeah. Well, we have a couple of questions, so far 3. And as I remember, you can submit, you can send your questions through the private chat. The first one is regarding Spain in the Global Peace Index. Spain has ranked this year the 38th position from the 163 countries that analyzes the index, but the Spain position is worse in relation with the one reached last year, in which we were in the 32nd place. What are the reasons of this, and how can you explain this being 6 posts behind? What have been the indicators that have caused to be this year in this position? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we saw a decrease. This is clearly linked to the 2 things. First, the levels of militarization. So we saw a higher investment in military expenditure, and also more activity in, I would say, weapons imports and exports. So this is, of course, going against the trend that we see globally. As I said before, about 100 countries reduced their levels, but that's also a trend that we notice within Europe. You know, this is this renewal of the idea of European defense, and this is also steered by the discussion about 2% of GDP to be invested in defense that is running at NATO at the moment. Another thing is, of course, and if you open this time window to a couple of more years, would be political instability and civil unrest. Political instability for a longer period in which there was no stable government, so central government, This has been settled now, and we are already seeing an improvement of the level of political stability in the figures that we use. And of course, political unrest resulting from, I would say, the independence call in Catalonia and the strife for independence there, and the unrest, civil unrest, and also violent civil unrest that this has created. So those would be the two main reasons for the decrease in peacefulness.
Thank you, Serge. According to the United Nations organization, by the domestic violence has increased globally by 20% during the lockdown, as many people are trapped at home with the abuser. So I wonder if this situation, since it's we speak in this case on domestic violence, if it's also inside the report as an indicator or not.
So it is not as an indicator in our report for example, gender-based violence. It's not an indicator of our report, because those type of figures are not accessible globally and are not accessible annually. So this is not something we can introduce in our report on an annual basis. On the other hand, we of course follow and we track the evolution of this indicator that is going to also have an impact on a more qualitative approach of some of the indicators. You know, the overall perception of violent crime, for example. As said, we have noticed also this increase in the levels of domestic violence during the lockdown, and as you have said, usually being trapped with the aggressor inside your home. And we have also identified the fact that most of the victims of this type of violence were women. So this is something that we have tracked, but it's not an indicator as such on the index. But we have other indicators that are also, I would say, include this perception of violence or the fear of violence that is related to this type of violence. What we analyzed and saw over the years is that an increase of the levels of domestic violence usually initiates an increase of the overall level of violence. So basically, what you could say is that if this is a form of violence that is accepted within your home, it's going to have a direct impact on the member of your family, a direct impact on society, but also a long-term impact of those members of the family who experience violence at a young or very young age, and that consider violence as being a normal part of society, a normal part of life. So basically, when you accept violence within your family at home, then you will have more tendency to also accept violence within society. So we clearly follow up this evolution. We follow up also the figures like the one you mentioned produced by the UN, but we cannot incorporate that, or like gender-based violence, the same issue. We cannot incorporate that in a global annual index, because the data collection is problematic and the quality of the data is problematic also. And as we know, a lot of those figures are not even reported by the victims of this violence also. So there again, it's an estimation, and unfortunately a rather low estimation of the reality that must be much higher.
Thank you, Serge. We have received another question regarding the impact of the COVID-19 on armed conflicts. Mm-hmm. And going beyond this, I would like to know also your opinion about how do you see the evolution in the future of the pandemic on the armed conflicts, and how do you consider this impact in your report?
All right, that's an excellent question. So as I said, we can expect two trends. It's a decrease in the funding of peacekeeping operations, but we hope also to see a decrease in the level of military expenditure, as a lot of fiscal assets are redirected to the economies. So those would be like two two expectations or two results that are linked to the Global Peace Index. What we also expect is to see regional and global actors, or even national actors, implicated in proxy wars. So, of course, with the focus on the MENA region here, implicated in proxy wars that are not going to continue to fund those activities as at the same level than they did before. So we are hoping to see also a decreased investment by national, regional, and global actors in proxy wars. Now, when it comes to the level of violence, I mean, there is a trend of a decrease of violence over the past 12 years, and the only thing that we expect by COVID-19 is to see a accelerated decrease. And so COVID-19 is already reinforcing what happened before and the trends we saw before. So all the issues, all the reasons that led to this decrease in violence are still present today, and COVID-19 is going to increase this. Just to give you maybe an example, a more strategic example at the global level. So I spoke about these deteriorating relations between US and China and the impact on the multilateral world. I think we are going to come out of this crisis, maybe face another one, I don't know, but in a different world. So the multilateral world as we knew it, really based on a liberal system of international relations in which peace is at the heart of the debate, and is allowing and facilitating interconnection between democracies, interconnection between economic system. This system is being eroded. We saw that democracy worldwide is being, the level of democracy is being eroded even within the EU. So I guess those are negative indicators, negative signs for more instability worldwide, and therefore also more violence used worldwide. Of course, the effect of the economic crisis, that's going to create some more civil unrest, most of the unrest being violent. We see that even in countries in which answered in a positive way and that were well prepared. I can take the example of Germany, for example. Even during the lockdown, frustrations emerged, and we saw civil unrest. The economic crisis is going to create civil unrest also, and people are going to take it to the streets. But the level of violence there will be, I would say, correlated to the level of preparedness and resilience before the crisis. But I would say that what is really worrying me the most, and that's maybe more as a strategic security expert, is the fact that we are shifting back to a more realist or neo-realist approach to international relations, and there peace is just a nice to have. It's not a prerequisite for the system to be applicable. It's a system in which power can be maximized, and therefore military assets can be used. So I guess this is a potential evolution at global level that we are facing at the moment. And us in Europe here, I think we have the responsibility to keep on believing in this multilateral approach, in the multilateral system, which has provided for the past 75 years peace and prosperity throughout the world.
Another question that we receive is the Global Peace Index measure normally current conflicts, but how about the evolution, the potential one? For instance, the fact of having a confrontation between India and Pakistan, or regarding the evolution of conflictivity in Asia. Well, the fact is that you measure current based on 23, right? Indicators. You measure in the index the current situation, but not the potential of conflicts. Can you elaborate this a little bit, please?
Yeah, it's an excellent question because it gives me the opportunity to make some publicity for other publications of the Institute for Economics and Peace. So basically, we try to. So what we do is, of course, with the Global Peace Index, we analyze what we call negative peace, which is the absence of violence or the fear of violence. And it's absolutely right to say that this is a snapshot of the levels of peacefulness at the date of the end of data collection. So basically, for most of the indicators, 31st December of last year, for the most volatile indicators, this would be the end of March of 2020. And it's a snapshot. It's a picture of ranking levels of peacefulness. Absolutely correct. But what we also did, and I spoke about this, it's positive peace. Positive peace is the systemic approach to peace. And that's looking at what you need to put in place to create, maintain, and sustain peace. So there again, we produce a ranking. So this concept of positive peace is based on 8 interconnected pillars of positive peace, and we have identified 3 indicators per pillar. So we really went in this process, in the development of this concept over the years. We used more than 25,000 data sets that we analyzed, and we identified those indicators that created peace the most, and then came up with the 8 pillars. Those 8 pillars would be good levels of governance, sound business environment, development of a high level of human capital, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relation with your neighbors. So India, Pakistan, listen to us. So really 8 pillars interconnected. Once you have an action on all 8 pillars, this creates a transformation. And we see that countries investing in positive peace, so having higher levels or an increased level of positive peace, will also get the economic, social, governance, and ecological benefits. So just to give you a figure that I usually use in my contacts with governments and international organizations, we see that an increase by 1% in the levels of positive peace equals an increase of 3% in your GDP. And we have other indicators like the inflation rates, credit rates, exchange rates. These economic indicators are all positive, societal, governance, and also ecological. We see that countries with high levels of positive peace will have lower impact of natural disasters. So this is basically an indicator of resilience, and it's a surrogate also indicator for the completion of the 2030 development goals, so, and especially SDG 16. So countries having a low level of positive peace or ranking low on the positive peace index would of course be those countries that might have more difficulties to create peace, or might have also something going on that has an impact on peace. Usually, and that's something we analyzed, but we did not really develop through a couple of years ago, it's what we would call the concept of positive peace deficit. So when we see that a country has a lower ranking on the positive peace index compared to the global peace index, so there is a difference, negative difference between the expectations and the investment in peace and the actual level of peace, those are countries that are at risk of sliding down into the violence trap and end up being more violent and more impacted by violence. So I'm pretty sure that when you look at the levels of the countries that you named, they will be low on both indexes, that's for sure. And if there is a positive deficit, they also have a tendency there to slide down. And I have to say, when we did this analysis, we had an accuracy of about 55%. So what we did is about 3-4 years ago, we took, for the countries that were then within the violence trap, we looked at the measures 10 years before and saw and analyzed those countries that we could have identified 10 years before. And we had an accuracy of about 55%, which is already pretty high for a foresight system. So yes, we can identify, and it's mostly then connected to positive peace. And positive peace has really been used also to produce the outlook of the impact of COVID-19 on our societies, to look at which indicators will be deteriorating the most due to the impact of the pandemic and the economic crisis. So yes, we do that also. That's possible.
We have still 3 questions.
Yeah.
One of these is referred to Africa, the Africa continent, and it's one participant asked about how will COVID-19 impact Africa's trade and market opportunities, and if this scenario is also covered by the report, at least in the second part, specifically developed this year and the occasion of the pandemic. Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question also. And actually, I gave a couple of interviews and I participated in a panel discussion on Nigerian TV about this, also with local actors. So I think what's going to happen, and that's what I said before, in a continent like Africa, we will see a slower take-up of COVID-19, but also a longer impact of the crisis. I think Africa has not been really a continent that has been impacted at the moment. I think it's still ahead of us, but it will definitely have a large impact on on the African economies. What we have seen, as I said before, also is that Sub-Saharan Africa is the second least peaceful country in the region of the world. MENA, with Northern Africa, is the least peaceful region of the world. So those levels already have an impact on trade and market and on the economic capacity of the country. Yesterday I was in a discussion about a symposium that is going to be organized by the UN Population Fund. So this was organized by the UNFPA in the Sahel region. So Dakar and Senegal and Niamey in Niger. And of course, when you look at those countries, you clearly see that the economic impact of violence is like super high. And the heart of the debate for this symposium and the scientific committee that met yesterday was about demography, peace, and security. So they have identified different strategic factors, such as demography, for example, that will have an impact on peace and security, impact on stability in the coming years. But at the same time, when they look for solutions, they see that violence as we know it today, so larger investment in the military to cope with the existing violence and the flaring up of the violence is also created a lot of impact on the level of unemployment, on the level of the economic markets, and also on the level of potential radicalization for youth that are underrepresented and have no access to the job market. And in the studies that they made, they had about figures that were close to 15% of the youth interviewed that said that they would be ready to engage with a terrorist organization or a violent extremist organization just because that would allow them to keep to take their family out of poverty. So there is a certain reality in parts of Africa that is impacted by violence today. And we see that violence for countries that are in conflict or emerging from conflict sometimes equal about 30 to 40% of the national GDP. So these are all financial assets that cannot be injected positively in positive peace in those societies. So clearly conflict has a large, and violence already have a large impact today, and this is only going to be exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and unfortunately the impact is also going to last for longer. So really for this region, climate change, as I said, it's like the two regions most impacted also. So we see a lot of strategic factors influencing this region, and solutions are not really at hand. And what's happening, the crisis after crisis are only going to increase those issues. So not really a positive outlook for this region for sure. A lot of indicators not really positive there.
Serge, we have now the last but three most sensitive questions.
Yeah, let's go for it.
The one is that the index is maybe a critic towards the index. The index assumed that lower defense expenditure would increase peace ranking in the world. But nevertheless, one participant asked that the reality show that another different result. It's that peace is a result of equilibrium amongst competition of actors, and in other words, deterrence. How can you explain it?
Okay, so I'm taking one by one those three questions.
Take this. I will pause you the second and third one. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I think that's a question that I receive almost every year, and it's a very it's a very good question actually. I think what we see is, of course, we are not. Of course, we follow an ideal, but we are not. I would say idealistic or utopic about what's going to happen, and we understand that there is a certain threshold of investment that needs to be made in military expenditure, but also in internal security expenditure. And I also received the same question for social unrest, when people are asking me, but Serge, when there is a high level or a high number of protests and demonstrations, especially in Europe, that's democratic motor for change. Absolutely it is. But it's also a measurement of the number of grievances and frustrations within society. So I guess, one of the pillars of positive peace is good relations with the neighbors. So if you would, and of course there is a competition, and of course we won the Cold War due to those investments and the deterrence that has been produced or has been created, but we are at the moment not at this threshold. So what we are advocating for is for the reduction of this competition, for the creation of a system where peace is at the heart of the system, and for the decrease of tensions between actors, and for the decrease of tensions within society. I mean, I'm absolutely not going to contest the fact that, and I can give you an example. I've had discussions about 6 months ago in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, and representatives of the government asked me, what can we do to get higher on the peace index, or maybe become number one day? And of course, I said to them, well, the first thing you should do is take your country and put it in the middle of the Atlantic. You would have more chances, because the environment in which you live is also impacting you. But there again, we can refer to this pillar of positive peace, that is good relation with the neighbors, making sure that the tensions will decrease. And automatically, if those tensions decrease, then your necessity to develop a deterrent force, both for external and internal security, will be realized. So we do understand and accept that there is a minimal level of force to develop, both military and internal security, but this should be as slow as possible. And this should be at least in direct connection with your strategic security analysis that is doing. And you can influence this security analysis. You can definitely do this. And so that's what we are advocating for. So clearly explaining that you can have an impact on your attitude, your institutions that you create, but also your processes, to make sure that the level of grievances, the level of frustration and tensions remain low, the level of confrontation can be low, and this will have an impact also on the investments you need to make in both the internal and external security. So we are not advocating for zero, but we are advocating for less investment in militarization, and this comes with a positive attitude towards your neighbors and towards your region, but we are not blind to the reality.
Thank you. And now I think I can merge the two questions in one, with other relating. The first one, how much attention do states pay to the results of the Global Peace Index, and are they really worried about the results, or do you receive some feedback before or after the report in order to get a better position for whether the current year on the next one? And if this one participant, I guess, shows some clarification about your institute. If you can, in this sense, add something else about it's independent. It's an independent one. What are your sources of funding, and what kind of structure do you have to decide your policy? That especially he asked about the independence regarding from the states, which at the end can or not influence to the results of the report.
Yeah,
very, very sensitive questions. Yeah,
it's absolutely fine. Two super questions to round up this very enjoyable discussion. First, about the countries and the reactions of those on the index. So I would need to say that, of course, we have this amazing media reach and this amazing media attention. That's, I would say, positive for 99.99%. We will always have a couple really out of those 3,000 articles, a couple that would be negative about the index. But those this negative press mostly come from authoritarian regimes who are contesting any type of information that is produced about their country. So it's really marginal compared to the overwhelming positive reactions to the index. We do see countries approaching us and asking what they could do to improve their levels of peacefulness. So I gave you the example of the Emirates, the United Emirates before. Other countries, or that's the type of discussion that might emerge when you're in a conference or participating in conference somewhere. What I also experienced myself here in Brussels is representatives of a National Security Council of an Asian country visiting Europe and Brussels, and who got in touch with me because they wanted to show to me their analysis about the global peace index and the positive peace index. And so this National Security Council had a look at their levels of peacefulness, had a look at their scores on the indicators, and basically took the 23 indicators of the global peace index. That's the mistake they made. They should have taken that's what I told them, use the 24 indicators of positive peace if you want to create peace. And they just drafted a new national security policy according to the levels of peacefulness and what was identified within the global peace index. And I think that's why we are doing this job. It's really influencing policy, showing, measuring and quantifying peace, but also the benefits that come along with peace to influence policy and to influence, I would say, the level of peace in the world. And the mission that we have set for ourselves is to create a world where maximum of people, all the people, can really flourish and develop their own personal capital or their personal potential. And this can only be done in a peaceful society. So we think it's very positive when countries take up the examples of those on the top ranking, and really almost all European countries are on the top of the ranking. And when you look at region Europe, it's first the EU countries, then the non-EU countries, European countries that are on the ranking. So clearly there are solutions, there are systems that can be applied to achieve more peacefulness. And we see that countries approach us and ask us what could be done in their case, and already take the initiative to transform it into government policy. So that's very, very, very positive. Now about the Institute. So we are an apolitical, independent, non-for-profit think tank, I said, based in Sydney, Australia, with regional offices. Sources of funding. So it's a private funding by our founder and still executive chairman. It's an Australian entrepreneur. And alternate sources of funding coming from sponsorship, coming from grant applications and execution of grants, and also coming from consultancy. So as I said before, we do create policy advice. We do support international organizations with our research. I think one of the last pieces of research that we are producing would be an analysis of the cost of violence related to violent extremism in Africa. This was done for UNDP in Addis Ababa, so UNDP Africa, and we analyzed the cost of violence related to violent extremism in 18 African countries. We are also going to produce a youth development index in collaboration with the Commonwealth Secretariat. So yeah, really, we participated in the past in the State of Fragility Index of the OECD. So that's also a source of funding. So it's a hybrid source of funding. It's sponsorship, grants, consultancy, and also private sponsor. It's our current CEO and the founder of the Peace Index and the Institute for Economics and Peace. So we're not really advocating we are not judging when we produce the Peace Indexes. We're just showing the result of our research, and it's an analysis of a quantification and measurements of peace in a complex world. And as said, we also try to bring solutions, proposing a positive peace academy and positive peace training.
Okay, thank you, Serge. It was great having you again here. I hope that the next time we can have you in INCIPE, as usually, for presenting the new edition of this index, or the Global Terrorist Index, that I guess is going to also to be delivered. I wonder if at the end of the year, maybe, but we will welcome you with pleasure the next time also at INCIPE. And then I wonder if Ambassador Alabart has recovered the camera or not, or okay, then you can maybe say the final words. We will hear you with pleasure.
Thank you, Vicente. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get a hold on my camera. Perhaps next time. But let me thank Mr. Stroobants very much. It's been a pleasure having you here, and it's been a pleasure to hear your very realistic picture on the state of peace in the world and its evolution throughout the last years. Let me invite you also for next year. We hope to have you in 2021 for the next edition of your peace reports. It will be also a pleasure. Let me just tell our listeners that we are still working before the summer. As soon as next week, on July the 8th, we will have one of our top military officers telling us about what the military have done in Spain in this last crisis. And then to end the summer, before July is over, we will have the German ambassador in Madrid telling us about the priorities of this German presidency of the European Union, which they are going to have in the second semester of this year. And this is going to be a very crucial semester for the Europeans overall and for Spain in particular. And with that note, thank you again very much, Mr. Stroobants, and so long to all our listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, and I hope to have better news next year. Sorry.
Thank you.
And in Madrid. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.